was a tough time for me because I enjoyed the Griffith shows.
Don Knotts made America laugh, but behind every smile, his life was filled with heartache. He was a man who brought joy to millions, yet rarely found it for himself. His journey from tragedy to triumph is as compelling as any comedy he ever delivered. He grew up in the shadow of a violent, alcoholic father who held knives to his throat. The scars of this childhood trauma haunted him for the rest of his life. Even as he collected 5 Emmys, Don was tormented by panic attacks so crippling he could barely function. In his final years, fate dealt him a cruel hand once again. He went blind due to macular degeneration and later succumbed to lung cancer. This is the story of a man whose laughter was louder than his pain, but whose pain was never far behind. Don Knotts was born in Morgantown, West Virginia, in 1924, into a family not expecting him. His parents were in no position to welcome another child. His mother was 40, and his father was struggling just to keep the family afloat after losing their farm. There was no room for comfort, no space for privacy, and no cushion to soften the blows life had in store. Don slept on a cot in the kitchen, while his older brother shared a room with strangers who paid rent to keep the family barely surviving. From the start, his world was filled with noise, stress, and constant reminders that survival came first. He was small, sickly, and often mocked by other kids. At home, the storm was even worse. His father, William, was nearly blind, an alcoholic, and mentally unstable. Most days, William spent his time lying on the couch, unpredictable and violent. Don had to navigate around him just to leave the house. Sometimes, his father's threats came with a knife in hand, leaving Don in a constant state of fear. "I felt like a loser," Don confessed. "I was unhappy most of the time." At 13, Don's father died from pneumonia. While it was a tragic loss, for Don, it felt like a weight lifted. But the torment didn't end there. His 3 older brothers, raised in a better time, had become bitter and angry. They drank heavily, fought often, and sometimes turned their fury on Don. They viewed him as weak, a burden to them. But there was one brother, Shadow, who offered Don a flicker of hope. Shadow joked, teased, and brought a tiny bit of light to an otherwise dark existence. Then Shadow died suddenly from an asthma attack. In a flash, Don lost the only family member who had ever made him laugh. Grief took root, and Don retreated into his own mind. He created imaginary friends to escape his reality. He began spinning stories in his head. His imagination became his refuge. And then, he found ventriloquism. At just 15, Don built a dummy named Danny and started performing at local churches, schools, and community events. This wasn't just for fun, it was his escape, his chance to feel seen. The first time people clapped for him, not for his brothers or the dummy, but for him, was a revelation. After a failed attempt in New York, Don returned to his roots in West Virginia, enrolling at West Virginia University. But the war was looming. In 1943, at 19, Don was drafted. While some thought he'd be a Marine drill instructor, that was far from the truth. Don wasn't made for combat. Too skinny, too nervous, he was instead assigned to the 6,817th Special Services Battalion, where he was tasked with entertaining the troops. While overseas, Don performed in a variety show called Stars and Gripes, helping lift morale with his humor. Initially, he used his dummy, Danny Hooch Matador, but after 2 years, something inside him shifted. The act was no longer about him, it was about the puppet. The crowds laughed at the dummy, not him. Even his fellow performer, Al Checo, noticed. Don had had enough. He was tired of playing second fiddle to a puppet. In 1945, while returning home from the Pacific, Don had an epiphany. He picked up the dummy, threw it overboard, and imagined it sinking, screaming as it disappeared into the sea. But he didn't regret it. It was the moment he cut the chain that had held him back. When he returned to the United States in 1946, Don was no longer hiding behind a puppet. He was ready to make people laugh as himself. Back in West Virginia, he took advantage of the GI Bill and studied theater at West Virginia University. It was here that Don began to hone his trademark, nervous, jittery character, the one that would define his career. This time, there was no dummy. It was all Don, all the way. People started to notice. During his time in school, he met Catherine Metz, a calm and thoughtful woman who was everything he wasn't. She was also engaged to someone else. But Don didn't back down. He pursued her, and somehow, it worked. By 1948, they were married. That same year, Don graduated with a theater degree. At just 24, with only a $100 loan in his pocket, Don left West Virginia behind. He caught a bus to New York City, armed with dreams of becoming an actor. But New York wasn't kind to Don. The city chewed him up, spit him out, and left him questioning everything. Radio auditions came one after another, but they didn't just reject him, they ignored him entirely. Directors couldn't figure out what to do with a skinny, shaky guy from Morgantown. Meanwhile, he had just married Kay Metz, and with bills piling up, his confidence was quickly disappearing. He almost gave up, but just as it seemed like all hope was lost, the very army connections that once gave him a stage in the war began to offer him a lifeline. Slowly, he began to find work. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. Then, in 1953, a breakthrough came. He landed a role on the national soap opera Search for Tomorrow. It was a game changer. Don didn't play a funny character here. Instead, he portrayed Wilbur Peterson, a traumatized, neurotic man who couldn't even speak to anyone except his sister. To bring Wilbur to life, Don had to dig deep into his own painful past, growing up poor, with a mentally ill father. It wasn't easy, but he didn't back down. He showed up for around 500 episodes over 2 years, pushing through exhaustion and anxiety. That role earned him serious respect from casting directors. It also opened the door to Broadway, where he starred in No Time for Sergeants. It was during this time that Don met Andy Griffith. In 1954, Don also scored a small role on Howdy Doody, a kids' show that was seen by millions. That was when something clicked. Don played Tim Tremble, a twitchy character that exuded nervous energy. The kids laughed, and before long, adults noticed too. What started as a silly children's role became a test run for what would make Don a household name. He wasn't just playing nervous, he was living it, and making it hilarious. But behind the laughter, things weren't as easy as they seemed. Don struggled with severe health anxiety, convinced that he was always on the verge of something terminal, even when doctors reassured him otherwise. His body was responding to his mind's turmoil, panic attacks, trembling, stomach issues. It all stemmed from deep childhood fears, which were now being reignited by the pressure of show business. To cope, doctors prescribed him barbiturates and early tranquilizers. It was the 1950s, and that was the norm. But soon, Don found he couldn't get through a scene without them. He was juggling roles on Search for Tomorrow and Howdy Doody simultaneously, but while the audience laughed, Don was falling apart inside. There were days when he'd forget his lines or seem like a different person entirely. Directors noticed, but they worked around it. When the cameras rolled, Don always pulled through. But off-screen, the drugs dulled his sharpness and made his moods unpredictable. Don Knotts was just another struggling actor, until 1956, when everything changed. He joined The Steve Allen Show, and that's where his odd, nervous character really started to catch fire. But this wasn't some random invention. Don had seen a man at a banquet in West Virginia, trembling so badly that he spilled water all over himself. That image haunted Don, and years later, it came back to him in a dream. He woke up, wrote the routine, and turned it into comedy gold. Soon, America was laughing, and they knew his face. From 1956 to 1959, Don became a regular on The Steve Allen Show. But his big break was still ahead. In 1959, when The Tonight Show moved to Hollywood, Don followed. And with him came the nervous character that had already won the hearts of millions. But Don's rise to fame wasn't all about television. Back in 1955, he'd been cast in the Broadway play No Time for Sergeants. There, he met Andy Griffith, and their chemistry was instant, even though they didn't share much stage time. Don had just finished his military service, where he had entertained troops as part of the Stars and Gripes variety show. After the war, he pursued a degree in theater, trying to make his mark in show business. In 1958, Don reprised his role in the film version of No Time for Sergeants alongside Andy. This marked Don's movie debut, and it made a difference. The film earned over $7.6 million at the box office, a huge success for the time. On set, Don and Andy spent a lot of time talking. They didn't just act together, they exchanged ideas, and Don learned how to be funnier by not being obvious. The idea of playing a nervous wreck who thinks he's in control stuck with Don. It became his trademark. Then, out of the blue, came the phone call that would change everything. It was February 15, 1960. Don was at home, watching TV, when he saw Andy Griffith on the Danny Thomas Show playing a small-town sheriff. It was the pilot for what would become the Andy Griffith Show. Without hesitation, Don picked up the phone and called Andy. They hadn't spoken in nearly 3 years, but Don had a bold idea. "Don't you think Sheriff Andy Taylor ought to have a deputy?" No agent, no audition, just a cold call and a crazy idea. Andy loved it. He arranged a meeting with producer Sheldon Leonard. Meanwhile, Don's gig with The Steve Allen Show was coming to an end. Perfect timing. Within weeks, Don had the role. Answer: Barney Fife was born. The audience couldn't get enough of him, and neither could the critics. From 1961 to 1963, Don Knotts won 3 consecutive Emmy Awards. Not for lead actor, but for supporting. And honestly, he became the heart of the show. His big eyes, his wild voice, and those shaking hands every time something went wrong, every bit of it was unforgettable. Don turned what could have been a throwaway sidekick into one of TV's most iconic characters. Who could forget the one bullet rule? Barney wasn't trusted to load his own gun. Instead, Andy made him keep a single bullet in his shirt pocket. And still, somehow, Barney managed to shoot the ceiling by accident. Each time it happened, he'd look heartbroken, hand over the gun, and walk off like a scolded child. It didn't need words. It was physical comedy at its finest, timeless, pure, and executed perfectly by Don. But Barney wasn't just a fool. He thought he was an expert in everything, from judo to singing to American history. He'd stand tall, puffed up with confidence, only to completely crumble when things didn't go his way. His singing, a disaster when he tried too hard. But when he sang softly with Andy, just the two of them, it was oddly sweet. Don knew how to play those highs and lows like a seasoned pro. Then came the shocker. In 1965, Don left right at the peak. He thought the Andy Griffith Show would end after 5 seasons. That's what Andy had told him. So Don took a movie deal with Universal, signing on for 5 films. But just as Don locked in that deal, Andy changed his mind. The show wasn't ending after all. Don couldn't go back. He was already committed, and it broke his heart. He didn't want to leave, but he had no choice. Barney's exit was written into the show. He moved to Raleigh, received a promotion, and took a big city job. But fans felt the absence. Even though the show ran until 1968, many felt it was never quite the same without Barney. In 1966 and again in 1967, Don came back for a few episodes as a guest. And when he did, it was like lightning struck again. He walked back into Mayberry like he'd never left, and guess what? He won 2 more Emmys for those brief appearances. 5 Emmys for one single role. No other supporting actor in a comedy has ever done that. Years later, in 1986, Don wore Barney's badge one last time. Return to Mayberry brought the cast back together, older, slower, but still brimming with that same magic. When Barney Fife stepped back on screen, it felt like no time had passed. But before all that, in 1964, Don took a huge leap into something new. He starred in The Incredible Mr. Limpet, a strange little movie that mixed cartoon with live action. He played a quiet, fish-obsessed man who turned into a talking fish and helped the Navy hunt down Nazi submarines. It sounds ridiculous, but somehow, it worked. The film didn't break records at the box office, but it made about $35.7 million, adjusted for inflation. The movie didn't skyrocket in popularity, but it proved something important. Don Knotts could carry a film on his own. That same year, Don made another bold move. He'd signed a 5-picture deal with Universal, thinking the Andy Griffith Show was ending. But when the show didn't go off the air, Andy continued without him. Don was locked into the movie deal. And while it meant leaving Mayberry behind, it ended up being the start of something new. His first film with Universal, The Ghost and Mr. Chicken, 1966, was a hit. It cost around $670,000 to make and pulled in over 5 times that amount at the box office. The film went on to gross around $100.1 million adjusted for inflation. The success was undeniable, and Universal locked him in for 5 more years. From there, Don's film career took off. In 1967, he starred in The Reluctant Astronaut, playing a man terrified of heights who somehow gets drafted into the space program. The film included real NASA footage and premiered just days before the tragic Apollo 1 fire, which cast a shadow over its release. Then came The Shakiest Gun in the West in 1968, a remake of an old Bob Hope comedy. It didn't become a massive hit, but it did fine, especially in small towns where Don had built up a loyal following. Critics in New York didn't quite get him, but audiences in the Midwest and South kept showing up. In 1969, Don took a risk with The Love God. He played a Hugh Hefner-type character running a risque magazine. It was an odd choice, and the film bombed, pulling in just $15.4 million adjusted for inflation. Don had tried to change his image, but the audience wasn't buying it. By 1970, Don admitted to the Chicago Tribune that he was confused about what people really wanted. He'd made a gamble, but it didn't pay off. Don worried that viewers were starting to get tired of him playing the same nervous character over and over. His final film with Universal, How to Frame a Fig in 1971, didn't do well either, making only $21.6 million adjusted for inflation and ranking 86th for the year. After 5 years, the studio chose not to renew his contract. Hollywood was changing quickly. Edgy films like The Graduate, Easy Rider, and Midnight Cowboy were redefining the landscape, and Don's clean, slapstick comedy didn't quite fit anymore. At 47, Don's movie career was cooling off, and he wasn't sure what was next. But that wasn't the end of his story. In 1979, a hit sitcom called Three's Company was in need of a new landlord. The old ones were leaving for a spin-off, and the producers turned to Don. At first, the cast was nervous. John Ritter even admitted they were intimidated by Don's fame. But once the cameras started rolling, it was clear Don brought something special. His character, Ralph Furley, was loud, flashy, and full of himself, especially around women. And that was what made it so funny. Ralph thought he was smooth, but he never quite got it right. But it wasn't just the jokes, people loved the way Don looked in the role. Furley's wardrobe was a riot: bright suits, huge collars, bold askets. It was pure 1970s madness. But those outfits matched the energy Don brought to the role. He used his body like a cartoon, made hilarious faces, and had people laughing just by entering a room. When Suzanne Summers left the show in 1981, the writers started giving Don more lines. His character grew in importance, and he stayed on until the show ended in 1984. Even after Three's Company wrapped, Don didn't disappear. In 1987, he joined another sitcom, playing a school principal for the rest of the season. A year later, he reunited with Andy Griffith once again, this time on Matlock. Don also did voice work, including an animated version of himself in the new Scooby-Doo movies. And if you watched TV back then, you might have spotted him guest starring on shows like Here's Lucy or The Bill Cosby Show. But behind the laughs, Don's childhood was far from a comedy. His father, Jesse, struggled with severe mental health issues and drank heavily. There were times when Jesse would grab a knife and press it to young Don's neck, shouting that he would kill him. It wasn't just one incident, it happened repeatedly. Don's mother would later remind him of it, asking, "Do you remember when you were in diapers and your father held a knife to your throat?" Jesse was eventually committed to a mental hospital twice, and he died when Don was just 13. That's when Don started to feel a sense of freedom for the first time. It was also when he began to open up, trying to find humor as a way to escape and eventually build the personality that would make him famous. But the scars never fully healed. Don's daughter, Karen, recalled that he had many moods and battled depression for years. He'd often find himself trapped in his own thoughts, unable to pull himself out. Even when he was successful, he couldn't shake the feeling of not being good enough. He once told a reporter, "I felt like a loser. I was unhappy most of the time. We were poor, and I hated my size." Even though he had made it, those feelings never really went away. His brother-in-law said Don always felt like he wasn't good enough. Despite the fame, the awards, and the laughter, the pain from his childhood lingered. The fear, the sadness, and the self-doubt were always there, hidden behind the smile. In 1979, Don Knotts was flying high. He had just joined the hit sitcom Three's Company, where his quirky portrayal of landlord Ralph Furley brought laughter to millions. But behind the scenes, everything took a dramatic turn when Don received terrible news. At just 57 years old, he was diagnosed with macular degeneration, a condition that would slowly take away his vision. Don, whose wide-eyed expressions had been a defining part of his comedic persona, now faced the terrifying reality that his sight was slipping away. He couldn't read scripts properly. He struggled to recognize faces. Even driving became dangerous. For someone who had built his career on physical comedy and sharp expressions, this wasn't just a health issue, it was a nightmare. Don Knotts initially kept his diagnosis of macular degeneration to himself, but the anxiety soon consumed him. He became withdrawn, anxious, and depressed, which deeply affected his family. His wife, Laura Lee, watched as he changed, becoming obsessed with accomplishing everything before losing his sight. His mood shifted drastically, and he sometimes locked himself in his dressing room before scenes due to the overwhelming fear. In the early 80s, Don took a risky chance on experimental eye surgery, which improved his vision enough for him to keep working. However, the toll of those years took its toll on his marriage. By 1983, after years of tension, Laura Lee filed for divorce, quietly disappearing from the public eye. In the early 2000s, Don was diagnosed with lung cancer. He kept it a secret at first, but by the time he sought treatment, the cancer had spread. True to his nature, Don cracked jokes about his diagnosis, trying to keep others laughing. At 81, Don was still working, voicing roles in Chicken Little and That 70s Show, and recording his final parts in Hermie and Friends and Air Buddies. Even with failing health, he continued to perform, driven by his lifelong desire to bring joy to others. Throughout it all, Andy Griffith, his oldest friend since 1955, was by his side. Their bond, formed on No Time for Sergeants, remained strong until the end. When The Andy Griffith Show was created, Andy Griffith changed the show's dynamic to allow Don Knotts to shine as the funny one, highlighting their deep friendship. Don wasn't just a co-star, he was family. As Don's health declined, Andy made sure to be by his side, even visiting him in the hospital. Andy was the last person to see him, aside from family. Despite Don leaving the show in 1965 to pursue movies, their bond remained unbreakable. Don passed away on February 24, 2006, at 81, after battling lung cancer and pneumonia. He was surrounded by family and Andy, who had been a constant source of support. The world lost a beloved comedian, but his legacy lives on. At his private funeral, Andy Griffith delivered a deeply emotional eulogy. Don was laid to rest at Westwood Village Memorial Park, forever remembered not just as a star, but as part of the family who brought laughter to millions.